Thanks for inviting us in. This is the Delphi Debrief here on WTHR+. Tonight, the question of whether Richard Allen killed Abby Williams and Libby German in 2017 is officially in the hands of this jury. In a moment, we'll hear from our WTHR legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. But first tonight, let's get right to Delphi, where we find senior investigative reporter Bob Siegel and Emily Longnecker. They heard today's closing arguments from the prosecution and the defense. Bob and Emily?
Hi, Scott. Yep, 17 days, 64 witnesses, almost 800 exhibits presented to the jury throughout the case of 17 days of testimony. And now it's time for the jury to put, in the words of the prosecutor, put all the pieces together. And closing arguments today, it was powerful. We got to hear from both sides, and really their job was to summarize their cases for the jury, and I thought it was effective on the part of both the state and the defense today.
Yeah, some very, very powerful moments, some words that you have to imagine that jury might be thinking about tonight.
Yeah, we heard first from the state, and then we heard from the defense, and between Emily and I, we were kind of laughing earlier, between the two of us, we have 80 pages of notes that we took because they were talking pretty fast. It took a total, it was about an hour that the state presented its closing arguments, and then about an hour and 17 minutes, if my math was correct, for the defense. So we are going to begin with the state.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, you know, now we're waiting, and we're all in waiting mode now, right? I mean, the jury had a chance to deliberate for a couple hours, we're told, before they went back to the hotel. They'll be back at 9 a.m. tomorrow to continue deliberations, and so we're here waiting, right? The families of Abby and Libby are waiting. The family of Richard Allen is waiting. Richard Allen himself is waiting to learn his fate now in the jury's hands, and really the town of Delphi waiting. And we see that around here. We've seen that this entire trial, right? This town waiting to hear how this is going to go.
And they've been waiting for a very long time. So we want you to hear what the jury heard right before they went into the jury room. The last arguments made by both the state and the defense. And Emily, let's start with the state. They went first today.
Yeah, they did. And they told the jury that February 13th was a day this community will never forget, that these girls went to the trail for a walk and they never returned. Nick McClellan talked about before they went on the walk, it was just a normal day. They were playing with a puppy that Libby had gotten before Christmas. And the last thing that Libby said to her grandmother was, "Grandma, I'll be okay." We know that her grandma said you might want to take a jacket when you go out on that trail. And she told her Grandma, "I will be okay." Then we heard details about the day, you know, the girls went missing, family looking for them after they were dropped off when they weren't there to meet Libby's dad, Derek, who was supposed to pick them up. And then we heard about the search for the girls from the fire department and finding the bodies. And Nick McClellan, you know, reminding the jury that these searchers, they went out there and they were looking for two girls that day, that nobody thought anything bad had happened to Abby Williams and Libby German, that a small community, this kind of thing doesn't happen in a small community, in a place like Delphi. And then he brought up a picture of the crime scene, saying their necks were cut, and warning the jury, this next picture is hard to see, but this is what they saw. And that is when we saw that picture of the crime scene.
And I thought it was interesting that he chose, very intentionally, he had a choice during closing arguments whether to show these gory crime scene photos again. He chose to show the jury those photos again with the families right there in the courtroom. They've had to sit through seeing those pictures. This is now the third time that I recall them being shown. So that was an intentional part, intentional decision on the part of the prosecutor to remind the jury what the scene looked like that day.
The horror of that scene, really.
So after that, the prosecutor showed the jury the famous footage that we refer to as bridge guy footage, and that is video that Libby German shot on her cell phone at 2:13 on the day of the murders, and that video shows Abby Williams walking across the Monon High Bridge, and in the background, you have to look closely, there's an image of a man in what looks like a blue coat and a hat, and the jury again got to see not only that video but the enhanced video that the state police crime lab had put together. And in that video you can see Bridge Guy much more closely. You can hear the audio of both the girls, and you can hear the famous line, "Down the hill." So they got to see that again, and then the prosecutor switched into talking about phone data, and that was to try to pinpoint for the jury again, creating this timeline of the murders. 2:13 is the timestamp on the video that Libby shot, 2:13 of Bridge Guy, and 2:32 the movement of Libby's phone. It shows no more movement with the phone at that point. So again, trying to establish that is the very small timeline, the window in which the state believes that these murders took place. And then went through and established the timeline of some of the folks who were on the trail and on the bridge that afternoon that seemed to coincide with that timeline, and asking them what they saw while they were at the bridge that day. And Nick McClelland said, "We know Bridge Guy is the guy in the video who kidnapped and killed Abby and Libby. So if we can determine who Bridge Guy is, we can determine who killed Abby and Libby and who is guilty of felony murder." So again, very chronologically, going from the time that the girls were dropped off the bridge up until the time that they went missing, building the case in a very chronological order for the jury.
Yeah. If we could find Bridge Guy, we could find the killer, was another phrase that was said in a different way. Same thing that you just said, and talking about how they then rediscovered that tip sheet, that file clerk, Kathy Schenk, rediscovering that tip sheet where witnesses talked about seeing a guy on the bridge. They find this tip sheet from this guy, Richard Allen, who has the time 1:30 to 3:30 that he says that he was on that bridge and saw three girls. So that tip sheet is rediscovered, and then
5 years later.
5 years later, right? Let's not forget that. And then Nick McClelland talking about how investigators went back to that Hoosier Harvest store video. They're watching the video to see what kind of cars are driving on that road that day. And then they bring in Richard Allen October 13th, and they re-interview him about this case. And he tells them that, yes, you know, he was there, and he also tells them, oh, by the way, I was wearing this blue jacket, right? A blue jacket, much the same way, a blue jacket that we know Bridge Guy was wearing. And then they say that he was getting a little angry, and we know that they executed a search warrant for his house that same day, October 13th. And Nick McClelland saying, we went to the house, we served the search warrant, we found a gun, a bullet in that memory box, and a blue Carhartt jacket. And Nick McClelland said to the jury he called it the Bridge Guy starter kit. The Bridge Guy starter kit. Then he talked about that next interview with Richard Allen, October 26th, where they confront him with these ballistic tests, saying this cartridge matches your gun. And Nick McClelland saying at that point all of the pieces are starting to fall into place. But in that second interview, Richard Allen, you know, telling police, I don't know how that bullet got there.
No explanation.
No explanation. Had no explanation. And then Nick McClelland pointing to the jury, saying, you know, if you look at that interview again, you see the way that he, in Nick McClelland's words, is manipulating his wife, saying, you know, I couldn't have done this. This couldn't be me. But again, Richard Allen in that interview having no explanation of how that bullet that the state is saying matched his gun got there at the scene. And then Nick McClelland telling the jury he racked his gun to intimidate the girls right before he killed them, talking about the bridge that day. And at the end of that October 26th interview, Richard Allen was arrested.
And after that arrest, it was an important moment during closing arguments because the prosecutor said that could have been all we had to present to you, but it's not. Again, basically pointing out some stories from some people who were out on the bridge that day, this cartridge that they found at the crime scene that they say was cycled through Richard Allen's gun, not a tremendous amount of physical evidence.
Right.
And the prosecutor saying that could have been it, but it's not, because once Richard Allen was arrested and went to prison, now all of a sudden they have all these confessions from him. And that's where he pivoted to during the conversation next. They played the confession calls in which Richard Allen said to his wife, "I did it, I killed Abby and Libby." His wife says, "No, you didn't." He says, "Yes, I did." And a phone call that he made to his mother also, where he tells his mother, did you hear that I told Kathy that I committed the murders? And his mom says, "I just know you don't have it in you to do something like that." And he said, "Mom, I wouldn't sit here and tell you I did it if I didn't." One of those moments during the trial that really stood out in my mind, because he sounds very reasoned, and he sounds
to his mother.
Talking to his mother. So they spent a lot of time during closing arguments talking about these confessions, these phone calls, confessions then that were written to the warden at Westville Correctional Facility, confessions that he made to his prison psychologist. And the prosecutor said he was not showing any strange behavior on the day of the confessions that were made. That was a big part of the conversations today, talking about these confessions and reminding the jury by playing the phone calls for them that this is a big part of the evidence that they have against him at this point. And the prosecutor said the phone calls that the jury heard today and previously, he said, those were unprovoked, of his own free will. And he said some of the confessions showed information that only the killer would know. They reminded the jury about information from Indiana State Police Detective Brian Harshman, saying that the voice, keep in mind, Harshman's the guy who has listened to more than 700 phone calls that Richard Allen made from prison, knows that voice well, and he was asked, "Do you recognize that voice?" And he said, "Yeah, that's the voice on the Bridge Guy video." And he's sure that voice of Richard Allen is the voice of Bridge Guy. So the prosecutor at that point said, again, now all the pieces are clear, all the pieces are together. And we've got a quote that was toward the end of what he said to the jury here. He said, "Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. He kidnapped them and later murdered them." He went on to say he slit their throat. And he said he stole the youth and life away from Abby and Libby. Very poignant moment during the closing arguments from the prosecutor.
And also, when you're talking about all of the details that he was reminding the jury of, Harshman, hearing his voice, saying that was his voice, also reminding them about that van that he told Dr. Monica Walla that he saw right before he was going to rape the girls. He said this in his confession to Dr. Walla. That van scared him, and he went across the creek, and then that's where he killed them. Nick McClellan bringing that up today, saying he gave a detail, that van, that only the killer would know. And then Nick McClellan saying, for 5 years he lived amongst us. For 5 years he lived amongst us, working at that CVS down the street.
He did. He ended by asking jurors to find Richard Allen guilty on all 4 counts of murder that he is facing. And again, about 58 minutes he spent speaking with the jury, and then the jurors got a break to kind of catch their breath. Probably a good time for us to catch our breath and send it back to Scott, because we'd love to hear Katie's take on what the prosecutor presented to the jury today.
All right, Bob and Emily, we'll get back to you and hear the defense's closing arguments coming up in a moment, but let me go ahead and reintroduce you again to Katie Jackson-Lindsay, former deputy prosecutor, current criminal defense attorney. She's been with us every night here on the Delphi Debrief on WTHR+. All right, let's do it this way. Why don't we talk about the 3 strongest arguments that the state gave in their closing arguments, and then I'm going to ask you for the weaknesses or any holes that the state may have had in their entire case against Richard Allen. So let's start with the three biggest things that they have presented during this entire case, including today's closing argument.
Well, I think that he being the prosecutor, actually broke it down into the three things once he summarized the story of the day. So he talked about how Richard Allen put himself on that bridge that day, first of all, which is a really strong argument that he puts himself there. There's no question that he was out there. He wasn't somewhere else. He was absolutely out there. Then he talked about how it was Richard Allen's bullet that, according to their analyst, matched that, his firearm that matched that bullet that was found out there on the scene. And then he talked about Richard Allen's clothing, how Richard Allen just happened to be out there on the bridge wearing the exact same clothing as the bridge guy. And so when you take those three things together, then of course the confessions, I think those were absolutely his strongest arguments, especially really honing in on how those confessions were made without being prompted. They were voluntary. He called his wife up. He called his mom up. No one told him to do that. And it was at a point where their experts say he was not suffering from psychosis.
Okay, so those are the strongest things in your mind about the state's case. What about holes in their case or problems that they didn't solve in this closing arguments?
Sure. Well, I think the first and most glaring is that he comes out the gate and says, Richard Allen is bridge guy. We knew that if we found bridge guy, we found our killer. Well, the problem is that bridge guy does not match the description of Richard Allen. He talked about how all of the witnesses that came before that jury explained that the person that they saw on that bridge that day was the guy in the bridge guy video, right? But they also gave descriptions of that person that were not consistent with the physical description of the man that is on trial. And I think that is their biggest challenge by far.
Because remember, those first few witnesses were describing a younger person, maybe in their 20s, taller, muscular, brown, poofy hair. Richard Allen was in his 40s, I think, at that point.
Late 40s,
and
exactly.
He's 5'5", I think, and a little heavier than some of the descriptions that those witnesses gave.
Exactly. And it seems to me that the state has completely ignored that inconsistency in their evidence. I don't think it's as big of a deal that the eyewitnesses that describe bridge guy are not completely consistent in their descriptions, because people will see things differently. But what they are consistent is that their descriptions do not match Richard Allen, the guy that's in the courtroom. And it's also telling that they never had a single one of those witnesses point to Richard Allen and say, that's the guy that I saw. And so I think that's a major hole that they chose to ignore, and I really think that could come back to haunt them.
All right, so throughout the 17 days of this case, we've heard witnesses who have interviewed Richard Allen in prison, the psychologist, the psychiatrist that have been there. But only one, to my recollection, was able to say, after listening to the bridge guy video saying down the hill, only one person was able to say, that's the voice of Richard Allen. No one else has said, oh yeah, the guy that we've been talking to, that I've been spending time with, that I've been interviewing, that's the same voice as bridge guy.
Exactly. And just as they presented the modified video that had been extrapolated in a way to isolate that voice, just as they had that particular witness listen to that video and then make that determination, they could have done that with any other witness that talked to Richard Allen. They also failed to address the fact that his DNA is not there.
Right, it's not at the crime scene, and the girl's DNA is not on the items retrieved from his home.
And it's his fingerprints aren't there, and so there's this idea that to some extent he was a mastermind who had the time and ability an opportunity to pull this crime off without leaving any evidence behind. But we also now know that he had mental challenges, cognitive challenges outside of what was caused by being held in those conditions in the prison. And so I think they left a lot on the table. They left a lot unanswered, and they really chose to ignore their bad facts. And that's really not good strategy. You have to put the bad facts out there, and then you have to give the jury an explanation for those bad facts to the extent that you can. And if you can't, you have to say to the jury, We know that these things may not add up for you, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because we have all of this other evidence that goes to the ultimate issue, and that was the killer, Richard Allen, and they did not tie that up in any way.
Okay, so that's Katie's feedback on the state's closing arguments. Let's get back out to Delphi right now, bring Bob and Emily back in, and go ahead and summarize for us the defense team's closing arguments today, because that was as stunning and compelling as the state's closing arguments.
It was, and I think the defense tried to capitalize on some of those things, many of the things that Katie just talked about. They started off by saying there are 4 themes here. Defense attorney Brad Rosie, he was the one who presented the closing arguments for the defense. He said the 4 themes that the jury was going to hear about in closing arguments: 1, about a broken timeline; bumbled ballistics, he said; false confessions; and digital forensics and data. And then he threw in a 5th one, he said, and this one's probably the most important. He said that the 5th theme is what the state doesn't want you to hear. Basically, what the defense had to tell jurors. He said time and time and time again, we had to do the state's job by pointing out things that the state should have told you. And then they spent a good portion of the defense's closing argument talking about those things. Some of the things they brought up was, they said, look, the state could have done a height analysis of the guy appearing in the bridge guy video, but they didn't do that. And if they had done that, maybe it could have shown that that was a 5'5" person on the bridge, but they chose not to do that, again, presumably because many of the witnesses had reported that the bridge guy that they saw was considerably tall or taller. They talked about hours of interviews from early on in the investigation that were lost. They talked about the state came forward with some evidence based on a jury question about how many vehicles are in the Delphi area or in Carroll County that match the description of the vehicle that Richard Allen had that day, captured on some video. And they say the state did not offer all of the information. They kind of cherry-picked some of the information that they provided to the jury on that. They said that the state didn't point out the fact that several of the witnesses that they brought forward to talk about seeing Bridge Guy talked about the fact that he was tall, that he was muscular, that he had brown poofy hair. Those are things that the defense had to point out to the jury. And another witness that said that she saw Bridge Guy walking on the side of the road and he was muddy and bloody. Well, the defense pointed out, wait a second. She started off by saying over and over and over again the person that she saw was muddy. And it wasn't until much later that she changed her story and said that the person that she saw was bloody. So they brought up over and over again inconsistencies and things that they wanted to point out to the jury that the state left out and didn't tell them about. And they said to the jury, Mr. Rosie said to the jury, you are the judge of credibility. You may discount testimony of a witness altogether if you find them not to be credible. And they really kind of pounded away on the fact that there's a whole lot of information here that the state didn't tell you, and that's not a good look.
No, and they also pointed out that the state left out those 2 interrogations of Richard Allen initially, the October 13th and the October 26th interrogations of Richard Allen, saying the reason why you saw those was because the defense, Mr. Baldwin, we brought them in. And they asked the jury, Mr. Rosie asked the jury to exercise your common sense and judgment. Take a look at those interrogations again. Sit down, he said, and watch those 2 statements. He asked them, how did Richard Allen act during those situations? Ask yourself, could you remain that calm in one of the most stressful situations that anyone could ever imagine, being accused of killing two girls. Could you remain that calm? And they pointed out, watch that video and watch his body language and see how he acts. So they have a different idea of, and a different interpretation of how those interrogations went. When you hear the state talk about them, they obviously say, and you see him get angry and you see him manipulating his wife. And so two different interpretations from watching the same thing. So the defense asking the jury to exercise common sense.
And another area that they pointed out that the state didn't give the whole picture or tell the jury everything is the state introduced 2 phone calls from April 3rd of last year in which Richard Allen confessed. But there was a 3rd phone call that the state very much wanted the jury to hear from earlier that morning in which he maintained his innocence. And they tried to enter that as evidence. And the state said, no, we don't want the jury to hear that. And Brad Rosie said to the jury today, why not offer up context to you? Why not tell you the whole story? Again, trying to give the jury, remind them that there were things that they could have presented to the jury to give them additional information that the state did not want them to hear. And he said, you must ask yourself why they wouldn't want you to see the truth. That's the way that they portrayed that.
They also talked about the state not sharing that Brad Weber's the results of the ballistic tests on his Sig Sauer gun that they tested could not be excluded. They talked very much about that, and they talked about that the state never offered that garage photo from Brad Weber's garage, which we know that they entered in and showed the sticks that were piled up in his garage, presumably to say, okay, sticks were found at the crime scene on the girls' bodies. Then you have all these sticks in this man's garage that's right near the crime scene, across the creek from the crime scene. Anyway.
And perhaps one of the most glaring pieces of evidence that the defense says that the state forgot to tell the jury about, in fact, that the state didn't even know about, was this kind of bombshell piece of evidence that we heard about just within the last couple of days, that the jury was told about, the audio jack settings, the data that Indiana State Police had for years now from Libby's phone, that there's information in there saying that there was a change in the audio jack setting showing that something was plugged into Libby German's phone. I believe it's at 5:45 on the night that the girls were murdered. And that would be an hour and 45 minutes after police say Richard Allen left the scene and was no longer near the Monon High Bridge. So the defense pointing out that basically that information blows up the timeline that the state has for this crime and tying Richard Allen to the crime altogether.
And then saying the data also showed that these headphones were unplugged at 10:32. So trying to suggest who is there at that scene at that time, plugging in and unplugging these headphones. The defense also saying if you accept that their theory, the state's theory, is entirely accurate, you have to consider that this is a very labor-intensive crime scene, and kind of going through the fact that you have this guy, Richard Allen, he is 5'5", you have these 2 young girls, he gets them down the hill, he, presumably has them undress at some point, then he's scared by this van, then he gets them across a creek, both of them. Obviously we know they're saying that he had a gun on them, but he gets them across the creek and then somehow manages to kill them both, subdue one while he kills another, and then kill a second girl, and then somehow get clothes back on Abby, all while not leaving any DNA behind, and basically calling this a labor-intensive crime scene. How could one person do all of that?
Yes, and so the point there that the defense was making is if you believe the state's theory of what happened, keep in mind, and they specifically kept referencing, someone who's 5'5", pulling all that off, they raise questions in the minds of jurors. Could that actually be pulled off by someone of that stature involving two teenagers?
And then pointing out, and 2 days later, after the girls' bodies are found, here is Richard Allen offering himself up to law enforcement. And saying, I was there, Right. So, and then also saying, for 5 years after this situation, Richard Allen, he lived in this community, he worked at CVS, he didn't go anywhere, he could have gone somewhere, but he stayed put. He stayed put in this community.
Right. And then they referenced the magic bullet. And I should point out that when the term magic bullet has been brought up, that was coined by the defense team, I believe by Andrew Baldwin. Every time that term was brought up during the trial, Nick McClelland would object to that term. The judge would sustain and not allow them to use that term. Well, today, during closing arguments, the defense used that term probably, I don't know, a couple dozen times over and over and over again.
Yes.
They were able to use it without any objection. And they talked about the magic bullet. And in the words of Brad Rosie, he said, where in the hell are the sufficient agreements and the marks that match? And he was talking about, and he held up pictures of the markings, calling into question how the state tested that cartridge that they found at the crime scene, basically saying that the science doesn't add up. They brought in an expert witness who basically said, yeah, the way that they chose to test this gun, rather than just cycling it through, they then fired it. Talking about apples and oranges here, they brought up questions about that. And he said this is a subjective game, in Brad Rosie's words. And he talked about the fact that the test and the work done by the Indiana State Police forensic scientist who does testing on firearms basically said that testing was so poor there was no need for us to have to do our own tests on it because we determined that it was completely unreliable.
Right. Then he went after the confessions, right? He went after Richard Allen's confessions, calling those false confessions. I mean, the defense has said all along that basically those confessions came because of the conditions Richard Allen was living in, those solitary confinement conditions. And if we can bring up this quote that Mr. Rosie said to the jury, he said, no human, no matter how strong, could endure those conditions without having some kind of breakdown. Also saying solitary confinement is damaging to a man or woman's brain. Also saying when the dust settled, he was there for 13 months. How much can one human endure? And then also talking about that the state, as he said, cherry-picked which calls that the jury got to hear. Those 3 phone calls in April, 2 of them where he, confesses to his mother, to his wife, but that earlier phone call in that morning gives it some context where he's talking about, did I do this? I'm not sure. Those kind of things. And the defense has always maintained that the jury needed context of that 3rd phone call, and they didn't get it. And then he also pointed out, look, he was psychotic. They gave him an antipsychotic, which by definition, if he's psychotic, they're giving him an antipsychotic to make him not psychotic. So he must have been psychotic. I thought that, that was a point that... He
said he was getting antipsychotic medication for months on end, and the entire time that he was making the confession. So Brad Rosie was pointing out to the jury that, you can't, you're not necessarily, psychotic on the 13th, and then all of a sudden making confessions on the 14th and completely okay. And they were cherry picking, according to the defense, which times they were saying that Richard Allen was actually psychotic.
And they also wanted the jury to remember that video that they saw of Richard Allen sitting there kind of dazed out and saying, like, if you believe for 1 second that guy was oriented and with it, that's just not the case. He was disoriented. He was not with it in that video. So they brought him up and they said that basically they had him in there to keep him alive, and that was it.
And there's one thing here that I think is really interesting to talk about. When talking about the state's contention that he was showing no signs of psychosis whatsoever, they talked about, they told the jury, you just heard these phone calls, but we invite you to go listen to these phone calls again, much more closely, and listen to the words, because at the beginning, for example, one of the phone calls, when Richard Allen is talking to his wife, Kathy, he says, I did it. And then a little while later, he says, maybe I did it. And then after that, he says, I think I did it. And then at the end, he says, I don't know. So he says that is not a phone call that indicates someone who is sure that they are confessing to something, and that from a person who is not psychotic at all.
Yeah. They brought up that, I mean, there was the confessions, there was the antipsychotics. They brought up the cell phone and the headphones a couple times. That was brought up a couple times. I thought that they hit on that a couple times. When we've talked about that briefly, the 545, the 32, and this was a quote that definitely stayed with me, and I think we're going to bring this up. Basically, speaking to that data, that cell phone data that they were able to take. The phone has no personality, it has no feelings, it has no emotion, no opinion. It just generates raw data. It speaks for itself. Wanting to point out again those headphones plugged in, then seemingly unplugged, but then also they wanted to point to that health app, that data that they were able to get, investigators were able to pull from that health app on Libby's phone, where it shows there was some kind of 20-foot elevation change. Do you remember we heard about that
Yes.
several times from both sides? There was a 20-foot elevation change, and Brad Rosie pointing out that location, some kind of 20-foot elevation change, could it be from the south side of the bridge down 20 feet? That would line up just about where that private drive then leads to Brad Weber's house. I thought that was a really key moment that I saw the jury listening to, and he said it's not ironic that road, a 20-foot elevation change from the south side of the bridge to that road leads to Brad Weber's home. Not ironic that there were sticks in his garage. Not ironic that his Sig Sauer gun cannot be excluded.
Yeah. Let's try and wrap up for you right now what the defense presented. Keep in mind, it was an hour and 17 minutes. We're trying to break it down for you in about 15 minutes here. The defense attorneys pointed out to the jury, no one identified Richard Allen as the man on that bridge. He went back and talked about multiple witnesses who came to testify for the state to say, I saw Bridge Guy on the day of the murders. And again, he said none of them identified Richard Allen as that person. He pointed out there is no digital data that connects Richard Allen to the scene, no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace materials at all. And he said, based on the description from one of the witnesses, that Bridge Guy, if you believe what she said, was completely muddy and bloody. He said there sure as heck would have been some DNA or something out there at the scene that would have tied Richard Allen from a physical standpoint out there. And he said there wasn't anything that they could find and that they could track back to him. He said at the end of the day, the state's timeline is crumbled. They showed, at this point, things got a little bit dramatic toward the very end of what the defense was presenting to the jury. Brad Rosie showed the jury pictures of a rack used back in medieval times and thumb screws. These are torture devices that were used to get people to make confessions. And he said, as a society, we have advanced since then. But he said the way that we get people to confess now is by sticking them in an isolation unit, in a solitary confinement cell, and throwing away the key.
Yep.
And he said someone should have spoken up that something was wrong in the way that they had Richard Allen in prison for 13 months in solitary confinement. He said, where is the moral compass? You are the moral compass, looking directly at the jury. He said, we are asking you to get Richard Allen, we are asking you to set Richard Allen free and a verdict of not guilty.
And then they brought up a sketch of a boa constrictor squeezing a rat during this time after we saw those torture devices. And they said, that is the power of the state, the power of your government. And then also told the jury, now is not the time to step back into the Middle Ages.
And you pointed out to me that your perspective was it wasn't just Richard Allen who was essentially on trial during these closing arguments today.
It was the DOC, the prison system, the Indiana prison system, they seemed to be putting on trial, I thought, at one point.
That is what the defense presented today. Again, some very poignant moments and very much intended to highlight, Scott, some of the things that the state either didn't say during the testimony presented to the jury, or some of the holes that the jury didn't necessarily get answers to.
All right, Bob and Emily, we'll get back to you for a final comment in just a moment. Let's bring Katie back in and talk about the defense's closing arguments. So based on what Bob and Emily have recapped for us, being in court all day, what do you think about what the defense did to poke holes in the state's case?
There's a lot to unpack there. It seems from Bob and Emily's reporting that they went at it very strong. You might remember that in our days leading up today, we've talked about how in the defense's case, they will just drop little nuggets and they don't have any burden, so they don't have to present a cohesive story, but they'll drop little nuggets along the way that they tie up in closing, and they did that. You might remember when they first started presenting their case, I said it's just not a good look for the defense to be recalling state's witnesses to remind or to point out to the jury what the state did not tell them. And they did that, and it paid off in a big way in their closing argument, because to be able to start your closing argument by saying, it's what you did hear is equally important to what the state did not want you to hear, that is absolutely huge. This jury has received an instruction on reasonable doubt. And within that instruction, it says a reasonable doubt can arise from the evidence or a lack of evidence. And we know that the jury is now aware that there's evidence missing that they'll never hear. But on top of that, there's evidence that the state presented that they gave you no explanation for why it's consistent. And now the defense has also pointed out there's evidence that they were hiding from you that we had to present as the defense. And so just to take that approach to it was really impactful. But I think it was also impactful that he laid out those things for them to take a look at, that there was a broken timeline, that there were bumble ballistics, and then there were false confessions. And so what we just heard here at the end about how they likened the conditions that Richard Allen was under to medieval times in order to induce a person to make these false confessions, it was really dramatic, but I think it was pretty powerful, because in the state's closing argument, they talked about how Libby looked at her grandmother and said, "Grandma will be okay." They talked about how this is a small town and this doesn't happen. They talked about how those girls went out on that bridge and they never came back. Those things are appealing to the jury's emotions. And we're not supposed to do that as lawyers, but the reality is they're human and we're human. And so that happens. And so this was a really effective way to even the scales in that regard, to say, hey, listen, this was a really bad thing that happened, but there's some bad things that have happened to Richard Allen too that shouldn't have happened even if he did this, because cruel and unusual punishment is just not allowed. I mean, that is restricted by the United States Constitution. And so they were able to put those things on display and also tie that up with that instruction that a reasonable doubt can arise from the evidence or a lack of evidence. So it sounds like they did a really great job of doing their job, which is to highlight reasonable doubt.
In your career, you've been a prosecutor and you are a criminal defense attorney.
Yes.
Based on the reporting that we've heard from Bob and Emily, which has been fantastic over the last 17 days, if it was you, is Richard Allen going to be found guilty or cleared?
I think that there is a lot of doubt on this case, and I think it is reasonable to have that doubt at this point. I do not think that, based on what we've heard, the state has met their burden with the inconsistencies of those eyewitnesses alone, and taking a strong stand that we know that Bridge Guy is the killer and Richard Allen is Bridge Guy, but having witnesses say the description that we are giving of this person that we know to be Bridge Guy does not match Richard Allen, that alone should raise so much doubt for this jury, on top of the fact that nothing conclusively ties him there that's not been challenged. Those confessions are really hard to overcome. They really are. And that piece about that van being a piece that only the killer would know, that is really powerful evidence from the state. But on balance, the jury has to decide who they believe, who they don't believe, what they don't believe. And if you go back to that instruction that says, if the evidence lends itself to two reasonable interpretations, you know, that last line from the defense about how that 20-foot drop in elevation would put that phone right at Brad Weber's driveway, a driveway that led to a garage with sticks that matched the scene, a driveway that led to a home with a gun that couldn't conclusively be excluded as having cycled that bullet, that's another reasonable interpretation of a potential other suspect. And so if they decide, well, it could be Richard Allen or it could be someone else, then they have to decide that he's not guilty, because there are two possibilities.
So is it your belief then that Richard Allen will be found not guilty?
It's my belief that he should be found not guilty.
Okay. Very good. Katie, thanks so much. We'll get back to Katie on another day. Let's get back out to Delphi tonight and hear a little bit more about when the jury will continue their deliberations and what is moving forward in this case. Bob and Emily?
Scott, do want to point out that because this is the state's case trying to prove whether or not that Richard Allen is guilty, they get the very last word. So even after the defense had a chance to present their closing argument, the state got a rebuttal closing, and it didn't last very long.
Not at all.
The prosecutor did try and tidy up on a couple of, I think, the points that they feel are their strongest points, such as they referred to the term magic bullet for the first time, and they pushed back on that term, and Nick McClelland said, I don't understand why anyone would refer to it as a magic bullet. He said testing showed it cycled through Richard Allen's gun, and state expert her results were verified 3 times, and the defense never bothered to test that cartridge themselves. And then they also addressed the confessions. And I thought it was an interesting line from Nick McClelland. He said, look, you heard early on, even during opening arguments, opening statements from the defense, that words matter. And he said, why don't Richard Allen's words matter in this case? His multiple confessions, many words out of Richard Allen's own mouth saying, I did it, I killed Abby and Libby.
And in the end, after that, it's a memorable moment.
Yes.
Nick McClelland brought the focus back to Abby and Libby, to these 2 young women, saying there are 2 victims in this case, Abby and Libby. But he said more than they were victims, they were also heroes. He said Libby was a hero because she knew to take that video of Bridge Guy, and Abby was a hero for concealing Libby's phone under her body. And then he left, he said, I'm going to leave you with this. I'm going to leave you with this memory, something that Libby told her grandmother, Becky Patty. He said that Libby told her grandmother, someday I'm going to grow up and help police solve crimes. And then he said to the jury, and that's just what she did, and she brought Abby along to help her. And those were Nick McClelland's final words to this jury, words that they have probably taken with them in their mind. It was a very memorable moment. You have to imagine that those words are reverberating at some point.
And I think it was a very important moment because, again, certainly it's Richard Allen who's on trial here, but the reason we're here is because 2 young ladies, Abby and Libby, were murdered.
Yeah.
And so it was a fitting moment, I think, to bring it back to the girls
Yes.
before the jury went into their deliberations. So we do want to mention that the jury got instructions from the judge. It took several minutes to explain all of the instructions. First, they heard exactly what the charges again are against Richard Allen, counts 1 and 2. They would need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Allen killed Abby and Libby while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. So that's count 1 and 2, and count 3 and 4. Richard Allen knowingly or intentionally killed Abby and Libby. So laid out the charges, then gave instructions, said you must consider the facts, told jurors that the state must prove each element that we just read to you of each of those crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. She defined some terms for the jury, intentionally and knowingly, for example, she defined for them. She defined the word fact. She defined inferences and direct evidence and went through some of those things. She reminded jurors that the burden is on the state and few other things. She said that, again, it's important that the jury not hold against Richard Allen the fact that he chose not to take the stand in his own defense. She said that a defendant is not required to do that, and so jurors are not allowed to hold that against them during their deliberations. She said that the transcripts of the testimony, those are not being provided to jurors. They have to go from their own memory and any notes that they took down. Yeah, those were some of the more, I think, important instructions. She did say that, again, jurors, they don't have to overcome all doubt. She said that they just need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And she said if there is a real possibility that the defendant is not guilty, you must give him the benefit of the doubt and find him not guilty. So jurors, as you mentioned right at the top of the show, they deliberated for about 2 hours. We weren't sure how long they would go today. They broke earlier than what we were expecting. They are back at their hotel tonight. They'll be back tomorrow morning at 9.
9 to 4. That's the schedule that she gave us.
And we do not know if we will hear back from the jury tomorrow.
Right.
We don't know if it's going to be a day. We don't know if it's going to be a week. At this point, we are here at the Carroll County Courthouse waiting.
And we're in a situation, too, if the jury has questions, we don't have any instruction of and any possibility of going in to hear what questions they have. So there's really, at this point, no way for us to know kind of what they're talking about, what they're thinking about, what's on their mind.
Yes.
So we're kind of troubleshooting that, I guess you could say.
Yeah, we will leave you with the fact that for the jury, this is day 25 since they reported for jury service. It's been 22 days since they were sworn in, and they have been sequestered from their homes and their families in Allen County. Their work is now, again, they are nearing the end, and this is the part that, everyone has been waiting for this jury to review all the facts, all the evidence, to review everything that they've heard from the witnesses to come to a determination.
Yep.
Is Richard Allen guilty or not guilty as far as the murders of Abby and Libby? So we will be here waiting tomorrow throughout the day to see if we hear back from the jury. And Scott, we will be here until we are able to bring you the conclusion and bring you a verdict.
Yeah, Bob and Emily have just been doing such a fantastic job. Since cameras are not allowed in the courtroom, they are there every day. Emily has been covering this case since those girls went missing 7.5 years ago. We so appreciate your comprehensive team coverage for us every night here on WTHR Plus. Thank you so much. We're going to be breaking down the Delphi Murders trial every weeknight at 10 o'clock here on WTHR Plus. You can also find our ongoing coverage, including detailed reports on each day of this trial, by going to WTHR.com/Delphi. You can go ahead and scan that QR code. Thanks for joining us.